since that time, I've written some more books. I've done some television and other kinds of writing. I've taught some university. But at heart, I'm still a vagabond, I guess.
Meet Palle Bo, a digital nomad from Denmark on an epic journey around the world.
My name is Palle Bo, and I'm a long-time radio producer. In 2012, I made a decision to start planning my journey. I knew that in the summer of 2016, I could travel. And I also knew that I was going to do a podcast and have a blog, and thinking, what should I call myself? And I started researching, and I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I saw a lot of YouTube, and I bought a ton load of books. I do mostly audiobooks, and one of them was a book called Vagabonding by Rolf Potts. And I liked it so much that I bought the paper version, and then I decided to call myself the Radio Vagabond because of your book, Rolf.
Awesome, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Well, it's been out for 15 years now.
Wow.
I mean, that's the thing, is that I was doing the math, and 15 and a half years now. So it's been, I mean, there's people who read the book, traveled the world, met their spouse on the road, had kids, and now they're ready to travel again with their kids. I mean, it's weird to hear.
And now the kids are ready to travel themselves.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. You know, it felt like I wrote it yesterday, but it's fun to hear that it's still resonating. You know?
And you don't age at all?
Well, actually, I like, in my mind, I don't age, but sometimes I wake up and see gray in my beard. So.
Yeah.
This is the Radio Vagabond podcast.
It is Friday, so we have another great episode in my interview series where I chat to people in the travel industry that might inspire you to travel more and maybe find a way to sustain yourself while traveling. This week is no exception. As you can hear, my guest today is the legendary best-selling author of the book Vagabonding that had such a big impact on me that I decided to call myself the Radio Vagabond.
Well, I'm Rolf Potts, originally from Kansas, right in the middle of the U.S. Where are you from?
Denmark.
From Denmark, okay. I don't know if there's Denmark's pretty flat, though, right?
Oh, very flat.
Yeah,
very flat.
So if Denmark was smack in the middle of a continental landmass, that would be Kansas, and if they grew a lot of wheat there. And actually, we are, for you listeners, at TravelCon right now, so I'm going to be reiterating some of this tonight in my keynote speech. Okay. And, you know, I grew up in a great home with really nice parents, but we didn't travel a whole lot. Like, we went to Colorado or Chicago, and I remember getting a shell out of the lake in Chicago and thinking, well, this is almost a sea. Lake Michigan is pretty big, and so someday I'll be able to see the ocean. And so I didn't see the ocean until I was 15 years old. And then at a certain point in my life, I'd always dreamed of travel, but I'd always assumed, I don't know how it is in Denmark, but in the United States, it's like, well, you work hard your whole life and then you'll have time to retire and travel, mm-hmm. right? But I saw, you know, my grandfather was in a position to retire. He was a farmer, but my grandma was sick and he really couldn't enjoy his retirement. And so at an age when I was starting to think of the bigger world, I realized that life doesn't just reward you with free time for hard work, because if anybody had done it, it had been my farmer grandfather. So I started thinking of ways to make travel happen. And this was and this is early 1990s, so before the internet or anything else. Yeah. So I wasn't only geographically isolated, but I was isolated from information in a way that's almost hard to understand right now. So I thought, well, I'm going to get a van and convert it so I can sleep in it. I'm going to travel America. Right after college, I graduated university, and then I worked as a landscaper for a year, $9 an hour to save up enough money. And I traveled the U.S. for almost a year, and I learned that it's not as dangerous or expensive or difficult as I thought it would be. And so instead of scratching the travel itch, I just kept traveling. And so in one way or another, that trip has never really stopped. I ran out of money. I moved to Korea to teach English, which is another really important learning experience for me, to immerse myself in a culture that's so much different than mine. Yeah. It was another big turning point for me. And then 20 years ago, last April, I got my first byline as a travel writer. And 20 years ago, November, I quit my ESL teaching job, and I've been a travel writer ever since. So this is a monumental year for me in terms of travel writing. But just to sort of finish the thought up to how you know me, after I became a full-time travel writer, I was writing a column for Salon.com called Vagabonding. I was starting to freelance for other magazines. And because of some travel advice I had on my website, which was very new at the time, not that many people had websites in 1999 and 2000, through a weird set of circumstances, an editor from Random House said, do you think this advice you're giving in your book on your website can become a book, because it wasn't how to pack your bags advice. It was more like...
So they approached you? You didn't pitch them?
Correct, yeah.
Wow.
And I'll talk more about this.
That's a dream for a writer.
Well, it is. My message was unique to myself. I wasn't trying to copy anybody else's travel advice. There were a lot of people, even back then, who would give you advice for buying plane tickets or give you advice for what kind of backpack to buy. But nobody was saying why you should do it now. Nobody was quoting philosophers and poets as well as pragmatic travel people. And so I think what attracted this book editor is that this was an existential approach to travel. The idea, if you don't travel now, when are you going to? And that time is your purest form of wealth, which is sort of a catchphrase of mine. And if you're not spending it in a way that enhances your life, including travel, maybe you should think about that, because we can really, waste is a harsh word, but we can sort of waste a lot of our years thinking about travel when in fact, why not take what money we have and travel? And so I think the editor recognized that and suggested it as a book. And, I had no idea that 15 years later I'd be, at a travel conference, keynote at a travel conference. I knew I was onto something, but, when you're starting out, it's hard to tell exactly how it'll be received and who will hear it. And so I've, since that time, I've written some more books. I've done some television and other kinds of writing. I've taught some university, but at heart, I'm still a vagabond, I guess.
This episode is brought to you in part by this website called hotels25.com. And this is a cool website. It helps you find the cheapest hotel rooms around the world. Hotels25.com. You should try it out.
I can really relate to what you're saying there, because when I was starting to plan my journey, I spoke to a friend of mine, and he built this big company, and this was 5 years after I started my company, and it was doing very well, a production company doing radio advertising. And he said, no, now your company's taking off, you should cash in, and then you can travel when you retire. But for me, maybe I would be more rich in money if I stayed in Denmark and just cashed in, like he said. But in this way, I become more rich in memories and laughter lines and smiles. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think sometimes, I'm not sure how it is in Denmark, but in America, we have things inverted as far as success and happiness goes. And a friend of mine, I'm paraphrasing this, so I'm not sure how accurate I'll be, but he said that in New Zealand, they realized they didn't have as many billionaires and high millionaires as other parts of the world per capita, even though they have a very good business culture. And somebody went in and crunched numbers, and they realized that after a certain point of wealth, New Zealanders just bought a boat and sailed the world, or got a house or put their money into a fund that would allow them to live in a happy way without having millions and millions of dollars. And as it turned out, New Zealand wasn't unhealthy because it didn't have billionaires. It was probably healthy because the culture in New Zealand is more geared towards quality of life, and that very successful people were reinvesting in it in their own life journey, and I don't even think that has entered the American discourse yet. It's starting to, in this blog and podcast era. There's a counter conversation, and young people are particularly attuned to it. The idea that experiences are worth more than possessions is much more of a natural way to think for a young American than it was a generation ago. So yeah, I mean, you're onto something, and you don't seem unhappy as a result, right? That
no.
You're not making your $10th million in Denmark, but you're off wandering.
Yeah, I have made 10 million memories instead.
Yeah.
The book itself is packed with good tips and advice, but the general theme of it is a lot about, it's not how much money you make, it's more like how much money you spend.
Right. I guess I've never phrased it that way, but it's how much money, or even how you spend your money.
Exactly.
How you spend the money that you have.
Yeah.
A line that I just sort of threw in the book that gets quoted back to me a lot is this analogy about the Charlie Sheen character in the movie Wall Street, this big shot who's trying to make his first 10 million. And in the movie, and I saw that movie on VHS when I'd already started traveling, he says, "My dream, once I get rich, is to buy a motorcycle and drive it across China." And I had just been in Asia. I knew that it cost next to nothing to do that. China is more expensive now, but back then it didn't cost that much. And really, you could have been Charlie Sheen's janitor and had enough money to buy a motorcycle when you got to China and do that. And so, it just doesn't. It's really, there's not. The pool of money can keep getting bigger. At some point, you're going to have to decide how you're going to spend it. And people assume it's the size of the pool, and it really isn't. It's about how you slice it up.
Yeah. Tim Ferriss wrote the foreword to your book. How did that come about?
Well, Tim was a fan, for lack of a better word, of the book. It was one of the books that was a big influence on him before he wrote the 4-Hour Workweek, which came out in 2007. And so in 2005, I got this email that said, "From Tim Ferriss, Princeton lecturer," and he wanted to talk to me on the phone. Another thing I'm going to talk about tonight in the keynote is that it's good to say yes. You don't know who. It's like saying yes to this interview, right? And so we got on the phone and we talked, and I thought, oh, that's a good idea. But who knows? I talked to all kinds of people who have good ideas. 2 years later, it came out. At the time, I think he had a different name for the book, but it came out as the 4-Hour Workweek, and within weeks it was a bestseller. And now, for every person who knows Vagabonding just from the bookstore or their existing interest in travel, there's another person who knows it through Tim Ferriss, because I've been a guest on his podcast several times, and he quoted it in the 4-Hour Workweek, and I wrote about 8 pages of Tools of Titan. Tools of Titans comes out. And so, then he produced the audiobook. When he was doing his Tim Ferriss book club, he realized that Random House hadn't used the rights to the audiobook, which is silly. And so we just acquired the rights, and he produced it, which again found you, right, among other people. And then when an editor at Random House realized that this book was pretty popular, that a book that was more than 10 years old was still attracting people, she said, well, let's update it. And I said, would you like Tim Ferriss to do the foreword? And they're like, yeah.
Yeah.
We will say yes to that. And so now it's interesting that in a way you inspired one of the really, really huge books as well.
Yeah, no, it was literally an influence on the 4-Hour Workweek, and then that inspired a lot of people back in my direction, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's a fun energy to have. You know, I could have told Tim no, and he probably would have put Vagabonding in the 4-Hour Workweek anyway, but just the idea that we were on a phone and he was just sort of this optimistic and very driven guy, it's been fun to see his journey and to see him be successful in ways I can hardly imagine.
Yeah.
And I can take anything you can throw at me, and nothing can get me down. Life is looking so bright, the sun is up again. I'm feeling like I could fly. No clouds in my way, no. And I'm living the good life. And I'm living the good life now. I'm living the good life, and nothing can get me down, no.
I met Rolf Potts at the travel media conference TravelCon in Austin just before he was about to give his closing keynote in a room full of travel bloggers, YouTubers and podcasters. So I asked him if he'd done some travel blogging himself.
Well, not an open-ended one. In 2002, I started vagablogging.net through bootsandall.com to help promote Vagabonding when it came out. And for about 12 years, it had travel content, but it wasn't a blog about a specific trip. It was just some advice. It was interviews. A lot of other people ended up writing for it as time went on, including some people who've become successful as travel writers. But it never documented my journey. And so I did another blog in 2010 when I went around the world with no luggage. And I think Boots and All sponsored that as well. It was called RTW blog, or roundtheworldblog.com. And so for 6 weeks, I was blogging every day and making 4 videos a week and traveling with no luggage. And it was a lot of fun, but a lot of work. And so it wasn't an open-ended thing. It was 6 weeks of blogging. It really generated a lot of interest. And it's sort of a fun concept. Yeah. And traveling with no luggage is a lot easier than it sounds, actually, as it turned out. But I have not returned to narrative travel blogging since then, although I keep the option open.
Yeah, but you write and write and write.
Yeah, well, I have bylines in other venues, and in the years since I started as a travel writer, The success of Vagabonding in particular has allowed me to do other things without being sort of a slave to the byline within travel writing. So I did a sports story for Sports Illustrated, and I've done some different kind of reporting for magazines like The New Yorker and The Believer and places like that. And so that's been nice to not just be completely pigeonholed, to have a lot of energy from the travel audience, but be able to write other things as well.
Yeah. And I'm not going to take much more of your time because you need to finish your presentation.
Right,
You have your laptop here, and you're doing the closing keynote in a few hours here at TravelCon. What are the best advices that you're going to give us in a few hours as this room full of travel bloggers?
Well, I've already covered some of them, and maybe a key one besides don't put it off. Like if you're thinking about it, find a way to make it happen. And if you can't make travel happen now, then find a way to make it happen in 2 years and put it on your calendar. That's one thing. And that's travel oriented. And along with that, there's the good old vagabonding advice of go slow and meet people. But in terms of travel blogging, in terms of travel media and travel writing, success comes in time. Everybody who applies themselves over the long term, I've seen succeed in one way or another, be it with a book or a blog or an Instagram account that people like to follow. And one thing I'll say tonight is that if you apply yourself to being a travel writer and you fail, or your air quotes fail, or you're not as successful as you thought you were, then you've traveled the world, which most people don't get to do anyway. So it's like even if you lose under the rules of travel writing publication, you've still done something extraordinary that most people haven't done. So it's sort of a win-win scenario.
It was fantastic to meet one of my heroes, one who inspired me a lot in my planning to go travel. If you want to be inspired too, get the book Vagabonding. In my opinion, it's the best book on living this lifestyle, period. Find the paper version on Amazon and the audiobook on Audible, or get both of them like I did.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe in iTunes or the podcast app on your smartphone. Pale can be reached for interviews and public speaking gigs on mail at theradiovagabond.com.
Next Friday you can listen to another conversation I had with a guy that also inspired me a lot. I started listening to his podcast Extra Pack of Peanuts, and he's got a company and another podcast with our mutual friend Jason Moore from Zero to Travel podcast. Their company is called Travel Indie, and through their project The Paradise Pack, they help people to live a location-independent lifestyle. He's even got an app that helps you find cheap flights called Jetto. And then he's an overall nice guy, and his name is Travis Sherry. Next Friday on the Radio Vagabond podcast. On Monday morning, you'll get another regular podcast where I'm heading to Washington, D.C. and pass through Charlottesville. You know, the small city where there were fine people on both sides, according to Trump. I had to pass through and see the notorious statue. Next Monday, we'll see if I found the statue. My name is Palabo. See ya.